continue to do these studies because we understand that revolution is an art and a science. And that one doesn't make a revolution simply because one wants a revolution. And the other thing that we are contending with all the time in this era that we are engaged in making this struggle is the fact that many people do not even understand the necessity of a revolution or what a revolution is and what it's about if they did consider the question of a revolution. We also confronted with the fact that many people who consider themselves militant and sometimes even revolutionary think that being revolutionary is simply blocking an interstate or talking militantly or profanely discussing white people or the police or something to that effect. We think that these are issues that we're confronted with, and we're also confronted with the fact that, again, some people don't even recognize the need for revolution. They have great analysis of what we are confronted with in so many ways, but they don't come forward with any aims of overturning the system or the situation that we are confronted with. Or when they think they're overturning the situation, all they are actually doing is improving the very instruments, the very organization that keeps us oppressed. So we think it's really important for us to have this discussion because the state, this organization of coercion, is the fundamental protector of the social system that we are oppressed by. The state, this institution of the ruling class that keeps us oppressed, that maintains the status quo, is the fundamental instrument, the fundamental organization that has to be dealt with in order for us to win our freedom. And the fact of the matter is that even when we use terms like democracy and we want democracy, most of us do not understand, in fact, that democracy itself is a form of the state. And that for the colonized human being, that what it approximates democracy is the extent to which we can push the state out of the affairs of the colonized people. So we want to talk about the state, and because we have a responsibility to introduce science and into the struggles of our people. And we know that in many ways, we are miles and miles ahead of the discussion that is occurring inside this country today about struggle. And that, in fact, in many ways, even the bourgeois media has embraced and adopted some kind of discussion about struggle. The bourgeois media, the president of the United States, all talk about Black Lives Matter, as if that were the instrument through which we would win freedom, or even if that plaintive cry is something that would result in the liberation of our people, when actually the declaration that Black Lives Matter can only be understood as a plea to the state itself, the very instrument that's responsible for our oppression, that's responsible for killing African people and other oppressed people here and around the world. So we have to have this discussion, we believe, of the state. It is the only thing that informs us of what it is that that has to be overcome in terms of realizing our aims to be a free and independent people. Today, what we are doing is the basis of this study is from something written in 1917, which was on the eve of the it was actually on the eve of the Russian Revolution. The revolution of 1917 that was led by V.I. Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party of Russia, that was identified with Lenin. And one reason we are interested in this is because Lenin led a successful revolution, and that took on for itself the responsibility of overturning the state and placing power in the hands of the working class. So this we're working from is a book called The Sate and Revolution. It was written by Lenin in 1917. And Lenin was someone who called himself a Marxist. He was an adherent of basic Marxist assumptions about the location and place and destiny of humans in society. And he was dedicated in the most serious way to revolution, to the destruction of the capitalist class, which is the class in power that dominates the entire world. It was a bloodsucking, it is a bloodsucking and parasitic class that presides over a bloodsucking and parasitic social system. Lenin led a successful revolution in Russia, and destroyed the capitalist state at that time, and put in place a state that was in the control of socialists, the workers for that moment. So that's one of the reasons we would look to Lenin, because of the experience that we get from his example, from what he was able to accomplish. And that's one of the reasons why we can appreciate some of the understanding that he had about this question, because he did lead a successful revolution. However, we recognize that there are shortcomings to Lenin's understanding, and Lenin himself began to understand some of these shortcomings, though not necessarily as it relates to the state. That I cannot say for sure. So to start off, let me just say that there is a study guide that we'll be working with. We'll talk about the objectives of the class. We'll talk about some of the most important points to know about this subject. But to begin with, I want to make the statement that that this study teaches us correctly that the state as an entity has not always existed in human society. That there have been societies in the past where the state was not there. These were societies that were without exploitation, without oppression of men, of women by men, of class by other classes, where people did share with each other in the society. In fact, the social system was based on cooperation and socialized existence. This is something that the Marxists refer to as a primitive communism or primitive communalism. Before the advent of states. And then according to the Marxist formula for the development of what they call human society, if you take enough time to study this, you'll learn that it wasn't human society that they were really talking about, but their experience was essentially a European experience, which was distinctly different from the experience of many other people on the planet Earth. But they talk about the Marxist formula for the development of human society begins with an assumption that human society first did experience what I have just characterized as primitive communalism or primitive communism, a time when there was no exploitation, no oppression, no classes existing. And this was followed by the slave state. And when we talk about slavery here, although slavery has become synonymous with Black people and what has happened to us, because what has happened to us has been the most profound advent in human history when it comes to oppression. It has defined the word slavery for most of humanity. But when this instance, they're talking about slavery, they're talking about something that existed in Europe, something that white people did to other white people. This was before, however, there was such a thing as known as Europe as such, which was relatively recent. And before there was something that was called white people as such. It was a time when these people who have now become the subjects of history, that is to say, Europeans or white people as we now identify them, they defined each other primarily in relationship to themselves. So that there was a time when there were Celts, and there were times when there were Normans and Saxons and you name it, that were constantly at war, constantly in struggle with each other. And but something did happen. And this was the slave period. And during a period of slavery, the two contending forces in society were the slaves who worked for nothing for free, and the slave master who appropriated everything that was created by the slave. This was the form of the society. And these were the two contending social forces, the slave and the slave master, the exploiter and the exploited. The exploiter, of course, was the slave master. The exploited was the slave. And then contradictions inside that society itself led to revolutionary transformation that resulted in a new social system, and that's called feudalism. So during the slave society, there was a state. Because the society is now split, there has to be some way of coercing people, of forcing people to work for nothing, to simply expend all their energies and see that their children are going to be born into a state of brutal, oppressive, repressive existence, slavery, working for nothing, and then seeing everything that they've worked for go to benefit another sector of the society that is idle, that does not work, and that its only role and responsibility is to simply feast off the production of the people who we've just defined as slaves. In order to do that, they had to have organs of coercion, force to make people do this. And this was the slave state, the state of slavery, where brutality was utilized to keep the slave in line. And then the contradictions in that society, it was wasteful society. It was a society that could not develop because there was no incentive for the people who were enslaved to do work. In fact, the incentive was just in the other direction. There was a disincentive. So people who were enslaved were likely to break the tools, to run away, to try to escape, to kill the slave master, to do anything they could in order to break from that. It was a very unstable kind of situation. And so the contradictions inside the slave state resulted in the advent of what they call in Europe feudalism. And feudalism, you are familiar with through popular mythology, such as the Robin Hood stories and King Arthur and all of these that romanticize that period. But one thing about feudalism was it was an era in which the vast majority of the people were peasants and serfs, and they were tied to the land. And they worked on the land, but they did not own the land. They were not slaves as their predecessors were, who produced in the previous society, but they were the next closest thing to slavery, slaves. The profound influence of the church, which was the Catholic Church, which was the church at that time, resulted in the church, having tremendous amount of authority, could even raise armies and send them out into the world, engaged and influence what kings and nobility were able to do. In fact, there was the concept of the divine right of kings. The king had all the authority by association with God. It was divinely given to the king. It's not because of any parliament, because of any elections, because of anything like that. The king, born into power, had rights that were bestowed upon him by God, divine rights of kings. And so there was the state was different. The state had a responsibility during this era of feudalism of maintaining the relationship between the peasants and the serfs and the nobility and the landlords, the landowners. This is where you see in the mythology of Robin Hood, who would constantly rob the rich to give to the poor, who would constantly fight the sheriff of Nottingham, who was extorting greater and greater taxes from the peasants and from the serfs and taking them to the lords and nobility, who were bleeding the serfs dry. This was, and the state was different then. So you did have the sheriff. In fact, the concept of the sheriff that we are familiar with today stems from that period of time in Europe, where the people were tied to the land and had gained no access to mobility, but part of what they created on the land, they kept for themselves, with the greater portion going to the nobility and the landlord. The landlord is another term that comes from that period of feudalism. So now you have the state functions to protect the status quo, the feudal status, to keep the peasants on the land, to extort more and more value from the peasants for the landlords and for the nobility, until, and this was feudalism. This feudalism lasted for something like 1,000 years in Europe. And this has been romanticized too as some wonderful period. And in fact, you have leftovers from feudalism with this whole concept of kings and queens and princes that get fed into TVs and movies and things like that today that make little girls romanticize about being swept off their feet by princes who would take them to some kind of life of royalty and jewelry and the rest of that. But they don't talk about how, and with this narrative, how the nobility, the prince and princesses, et cetera, kings and queens, lived at the expense of other people, of the vast majority of the people. This is an issue that can easily be found with the notion in our own communities when you hear brothers and sisters who, in response to the oppression that we experience as a people everywhere, and in response to the narrative that's been created by white people, white power about their royalty, et cetera, we create a notion of royalty of our own, and we talk about ourselves as queens and kings, and my queen and my king, et cetera, when the kings and queens was blood-sucking people who had no value, no worth at all, except they lorded over the other people from whom they stole their resources. So moving from this, so the state was different here than it was under slavery, where slavery, primary responsibility to maintain the status quo of the slave and the slave master, to protect that system, to make sure nothing happened, to kill, crush, jail. And they had various forms of punishments that you've seen movies of, where they would stick people in stocks in the middle of the square and with their heads and arms through these holes that from which they could not escape, and they held up to public ridicule, et cetera, and during periods of feudalism. And now with feudalism becomes very difficult to maintain also, because even though the producers, who are the peasants and the serfs, are not exploited absolutely as were the slaves, the exploitation is horrendous, to the point that in some times and places, people didn't even have clothing to wear and were literally naked, where the local priest had rites of first night with the brides of peasants, et cetera. I mean, it was just a horrible kind of oppressive circumstance. And then this state looked differently, but something else happened. And this was the rise of capitalism. So the capitalist state is different. But however, there is no, while there is some pretext that the capitalist state came into being as a consequence of contradictions and struggles inside the feudal society, they tell us, you can see it in plain sight, but it's dismissed anyway, that capitalism itself comes into existence as a consequence of slavery and colonialism. It was from feudalism, you had these forces who went out into the world. Sometimes they were pirates, sometimes they were commissioned by the nobility themselves. You had these royal companies who engaged in slavery, who engaged in what they called exploration, which was like looting expeditions, where they traveled as much as they could around the earth, and they would take people's territories, take their lands, enslave different people, and almost killed off an entire hemisphere with the so-called indigenous, so-called Indians, the indigenous people, et cetera. Take all this land. They made war against China that resulted in tremendous amounts of value being coming from China, and where they turned China into a nation of drug addicts. They similarly in Vietnam, the French did this, and of course the enslavement of our people on the continent of Africa and here inside the United States. And even though they called it colonialism in Africa, there was not a fundamental difference in what happened on the continent, where the entire continent of Africa was transformed into 12 million square miles of territory from whence that Africans were stolen and enslaved and turned into producers of tremendous amounts of wealth, of value for these people who had previously been connected to feudal economy. And now through this process, another economy grows up right underneath, right inside the feudal society, and a whole new social force takes power. It starts even having revolutionaries cutting off the heads of kings and queens, and they called this a democratic revolution that happened throughout Europe, but it was fueled by this process, this new wealth that came in, so that even this new class was richer than the prevailing ruling class that of under feudalism, the kings and the queens. They lost their wealth comparatively to this new social force that was rising up. New forms of production began to develop, where previously the peasants was the primary producer, the serf was the primary producer. Now the serfs and the peasants, not only beginning not to be the primary producers, but this form of production hinders the ability of this new form coming into existence as under the authority and power of a new social force that's called the capitalist class. And so you have this revolutionary movement led by bloodthirsty capitalists who bringing in slavery and colonialism, but they also bring the Industrial Revolution through Europe. They enhance the production capacity and change it so that now people who were previously simply tied to the land of the nobility are needed to work in factories that have to produce a lot of hats and a lot of clothing at the same time, because they got people who they have to put on ships that they now have to have workers to build these ships, et cetera. And then they have to have places for them to stay. So they are now building houses, and towns are shooting up in these various places to facilitate the growth of this new economic power, this capitalist power. And here the state changes also. And the point that I want to make is that what really gives definition to this state, the capitalist state, was born. Unlike the feudal and the slave state in Europe, the capitalist state was born in a direct oppressive relationship with African people, with so-called Indians, the indigenous peoples around the world. It was born to facilitate this theft of resources that was coming from Asia, coming from the Americas, and coming from Africa. This is what gives birth to the capitalist system, and it helps to shape and form and define what would become the capitalist state, distinguishing it from the states that preceded it. Lenin didn't talk about this. Marx didn't talk about this. This is the contribution of African internationalism. This is my contribution to this whole discussion, not only of the state, but of the development of capitalism itself. So I wanted to give that. I know it was a long kind of overview, but I think it's really important to start in this fashion, because for one thing, most of the people who we are talking to are new to political life, new to revolutionary political science. And I think it's just important to try to lay whatever foundation is possible. I know people are learning many people are learning what they understand about the world from Google, from the internet, social media and stuff like this. And reading is increasingly something that is becoming less significant, but it's important to have a certain kind of foundation if we're going to understand what it is that we're dealing with right now, and not allow certain kind of political and literacy to remain primarily in the domains of white people and the rulers of this country. So this is a thing that distinguishes the capitalist state, is distinguished from the feudal state, from the slave state, by the fact that the capitalist state itself was born from, just as capitalism was born of the relationship that the capitalists have with the enslaved, with the colonized, with the oppressed peoples of the world. And that became the primary locus, the primary focus of the role of the state. And that's a really important thing to understand, because if we understand that the state actually is class, is the power of a particular class, of a ruling class, then it helps us to understand that the fundamental question of class struggle resides not in the struggle between white workers and white bosses, or within the white community as it exists, but primarily, it doesn't mean it's not there at all, but the primary struggle is between capitalism in all of its manifestations and colonized people. The colonial question, the class struggle is concentrated in the colonial question. And this is something that Lenin did not talk about, nor did Marx. And this is something that's been our responsibility to discover and to talk about. So I wanted to say that. I also want to say that I think that with that kind of overview and with this kind of understanding, I truly believe it would be important for people to read the book State and Revolution by Lenin. For those, and it's not to say it's going to be an easy read, because it's not. It's a difficult read just because you know, some of the historical factors mentioned here will not necessarily be immediately clear to people who have not studied, you know, any kind of history of revolution, but read it anyway and read it again. And because you can understand it without knowing all those things. You can understand it, and it's really important for you to understand. And there's a shorter version, not exactly a shorter version, but a shorter piece that was done by Lenin, just called The State. And that's a shorter pamphlet. And it's a popularly written pamphlet. It's from a discussion that he gave to a class after the Russian Revolution had succeeded, and Lenin spoke rather impromptu. How do you say it? He came and he spoke at this class. I don't think it had been planned in a study, impromptu kind of a presentation, and it's called The State. Then what we're working with is the state and revolution. And the reason this was written is because, like now, there was this whole question of people who thought many people who felt like they could talk their way into freedom and seduce the rulers and the ones who were in authority to just be nicer and give up power and authority to the people. And there were some who thought that that revolution was not necessary, that things could improve to the extent that the working people and the poor and oppressed, this is in Europe, could have a decent life without revolution. And then there were others, the anarchists, who recognized the existence of the state, hated the state, felt like the state should be overturned, but who did not believe that the workers needed to have a power and authority of its own in order to shape the society that the workers would be creating. We believe that the state has to be destroyed, but we believe, and this is the African People's Socialist Party and African Internationalists, and we also believe, however, that the destruction of the state, of the bourgeois state, the colonial state, the authority that presides over our lives, the police and the armies and the militaries and the institutions, the forces that control them, that bureaucracy needs to be crushed and taken out of the lives of our people. But even after that occurs, as that occurs, we need to have our own power. The African working class has to have our own power. And until that point where classes have been decimated and the working class ourselves learn new habits and traditions and are not just moving off of a trajectory that had been put in motion by oppressions and all of its institutions and cultural things and et cetera. So that there temporarily has to be rule by the African working class, and that rule is called socialism. And socialism is simply when the state is the armed workers, the working class in arms. What we're talking about, it places so much emphasis on the role of the working class and under the leadership of this advanced detachment, which is the African People's Socialist Party. And this is something that contributes to a certain aspect of complications to the struggle, because the working class is so beaten down often, especially the colonized working class, that has lost confidence in itself, that it has not acquired certain kinds of traditions of leadership that you will find throughout the bourgeois and white societies, where people learn almost daily how to lead. Even if it's not taught under the subject how to lead, it's taught on how to be white. And white people learn to lead because of the relationship that they always have with Africans, indigenous people, Mexicans, and what have you. And we learn how to be led. The instinct that even many Africans have when approaching a lone white woman in a situation, and want to make sure that the white woman does not think that we are a threat. I mean, we learn how to be led. We learn how to be harmless, or even to give the appearance of harmlessness. And the white woman who's approaching us also has learned her role and her power. And it's something that's validated every day in life. But anyway, I've spoken of that enough. I think it's important to say that. And I want to go ahead and look at the study guide that we'll be working with. And this on the State and Revolution by V.I. Lenin. And with some intervention based on things that have been written and introduced to this science by African internationalism. So part of what our task is here is we want to instill in the students the understanding, for those of you, the understanding of the state as a coercive institution that protects the class in power. When we open up this discussion, we played just a brief piece from a Dead Prayers song. I think it's called Police State, and where it was introduced by a presentation that I made some time ago on the state, and talking about the state is the police, it's the military, it's the courts, it's the jails, it's the system, et cetera, and that it's there, comes into existence precisely because it comes into existence when a society is split between the haves and the have-nots. And those who have do so as a consequence of what they take from those who do not have in society. We want to teach the understanding of the colonial state as experienced by the African working class and all of its faces. And that's really important to talk about the colonial state. Lenin talked about the state. And this is how many people who call themselves scientists, socialists, Marxists, etc., they understand the state, but they don't understand the colonial state, and which is what African people experience every day in our lives, whether we are in some place like Equatorial Guinea or Sudan, or whether we are in Detroit or Michigan or St. Petersburg, Florida. It's the colonial state that we are confronted with, which is why the state acts differently. Again, we're talking about the police being an arm of the state. Why we see that the state acts differently when it deals with African people than it does with white people. When it deals with Mexicans differently than it does with white people. It is a colonial state. It is not just the state in general, but it is the colonial state. And it's because we are colonized. The indigenous people here are colonized. The so-called Mexican people are colonized often on their own land. So we want to show how counterinsurgency is a function of the imperialist state, counterinsurgency. We want to show that liberated Africa will be governed by the state of the African working class. People like to use the term black power, black power, black power. What does black power mean? It's not just a slogan. It's not just something you put on your T-shirt, not just something that can be chanted. Even when the question black power exploded into human consciousness as a consequence of struggle that Africans were engaged in here in Mississippi in 1966, there was not a common understanding what black power meant, even to those who said it. And what we have to say that real power has to be state power. It has to be black state power. We have to have our own power. That is what's necessary to deal with the colonial state that we are confronted with. Then here's what we want people to understand about this subject of the state. At least this is some of what we want people to understand. That the state arises when a society is split into classes, the haves and have-nots. And this statement makes the assumption, again, that society has not always been split into classes. Not only that, the reality is that class distinctions were sharpest in Europe, perhaps, than any place in the world. Perhaps in any place, certainly sharper in Europe than in Africa, most of the African experiences and the indigenous peoples that we are confronted with. And there's a reason for that. The state is an organ of violence and coercion that's protecting and serving the interests of a definite class. The state is an organ of violence, and like we said, that under slavery, nobody is going to willingly accede to everything they do, going to feed the bellies of people who don't do anything, and a system that guarantees that their children and their children's children will have the same fate of simply being property owned by somebody else. You have to use extreme forms of violence in order to maintain that situation. And that violence is something that is instituted and perpetuated by the state that protects the interests of the class that's in power. It protects that relationship between the slave and the slave master. The state upholds the dominant force of a given system and the class that's in power. That's what the state does. It upholds the dominant. The state does not represent you. I don't care how often you go to court. I don't care what kind of jury selection process that they initiate. The state upholds the dominant force of a given social system and the class that's in power. It protects, in the capitalist system, it protects property. It protects white people who are the colonizer from the colonized. And the only time that you will see white people really punished by the state is when somehow what they do challenges the authenticity, undermines the same social system that is most likely challenged and undermined by the activities of African and other colonized people. That the bourgeois state, when we say bourgeoisie, the bourgeois state, that is the state of the bourgeoisie, that is the state of the ruling class, that is the state of the capitalist class. We say that the bourgeois state is differentiated from past states and in societies. The bourgeois state was born as an international state tied to the birth of parasitic capitalism on the backs of enslaved Africans and colonized peoples everywhere. This is where the bourgeois state comes into being. This is what gives definition, shape, form to the police, to the armies, to the military, all the military forces, et cetera, that we see. This is why we live in a state of perennial warfare today, because the role of the bourgeois state is to protect the status quo. And then what we're talking about is to protect the status quo, the relationship between the colonized and the colonizer. And so this is why we see military forces bombing people in Syria and Afghanistan, and why the United States government facilitate the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba, murder of Patrice Lumumba, the overthrow of Nkrumah, and also the recent murder of Muammar Gaddafi. So it's different. It's not the French state, feudal state, or even the emerging capitalist state fighting against the French workers. It's different from that. And if you would even investigate even the early capitalist expressions, even in France, was that the revolution that's often held up as the ideal revolution that gave direction to what communism would be about and what the struggle should be about? In France, the commune, the struggle, the revolutionary struggle that gave rise to the commune. This was in the 18th century. This led to the workers were crushed and defeated finally by the French state. But do you know what the French state did to these workers? Many of them that survived, they sent them to a place in the Pacific. that's called New Caledonia. And my point is that while the state, a French state, directed this attack on the workers there, and within the uprising of the French Commune, they had already suppressed the people who were in New Caledonia, and so they sent them as punishment to New Caledonia, where over a period of a couple of centuries, they are now the dominant forces in New Caledonia, and they are oppressing the African people who are in New Caledonia. So the state, you know, when we look at how Marx and Lenin and Engels and all these talked about the state and how it acted in society, they are talking principally about how it happened in European or white society, and et cetera. You will see other evidence of that. You talk about the white people, for example, the Jews, who in the 1930s were fleeing German oppression and murder. And where did they go? Many of them, they ended up in Kenya, which was, and they were free in Kenya. But Kenya itself was a colony of the British. So the Africans in Kenya were dying and being oppressed, the land being stolen, et cetera. But the white people who are escaping what they call fascism in Germany can be free in the colonial territory of a British colony called Kenya. You see that it's up to us to make sense of this and to give it a proper definition. So I want to say that that the state is an organ of violence and coercion, protecting and serving the interests of a definite class. The state upholds the dominant forces of a given social system and the class in power. The bourgeois state is differentiated from past states and societies. The bourgeois state was born as an international state. And 5, the capitalist colonial state protects the capitalist social system, and the bourgeoisie, a social bourgeoisie. The capitalist colonial state protects the capitalist social system and the bourgeoisie, that is the capitalist ruling class, and a socialist state protects the socialist social system and the working class. So the state is always oppressive, always. There's no state that's not oppressive. If you got a state, you got oppression. The question for us is, who is being oppressed? And we hate the state. We think the state has to be destroyed, period. That there is no place in human society for these instruments, these of power and coercion that dominates a sector of the population. It has to go. But what gave rise to the bourgeois state, to the capitalist state, was exploitation, oppression, colonialism, and this is where the whole capitalist class system, class oppression has its energy that it was born from. So this thing has to be overturned. But once you overturn it, then what? This is the social force, this is the class, the bourgeoisie, that has all the experience in violence, all the experience in world domination, have all the connections all around the world. They know how to run the factories and do every damn thing else. And the workers can't just say, okay, now we've overthrown it, there's no state. The workers have to have our own state in order to suppress those who have suppressed us, and to make it impossible for them to come back to power and to create a system that satisfies the interests only of this minority, blood-sucking, tyrannical entity called the bourgeoisie, white power, if you will, etc. And that has to be overthrown, and the workers have to come to power. And the workers have to come to power under the leadership of the African working class. And so that power, that institutes socialism, that changes how things are produced and the relations that exist in society for the production of what it is that human beings need, that society that is governed by the workers in arms is called socialism, which is the early stage of communism, at which time classes no longer exist, and we don't have institutions governing people. We simply have processes that administer things. That's the system that we're fighting for. So we say that the state involves the establishment of a special force, a public power that appears to stand above society and is always repressive. A special force, a public power, that replaces the notion of self-organizing masses of people who have power over our lives. It's now this public force that can exact taxes from the people, so it comes out of society, but it lords it over society. It can extort taxes and other kinds of privileges for itself. That's why you have a situation where it's hard to even prosecute a cop, because the cops, this is an organ of the state, and it writes this, the institutions that of the state power writes into law all kinds of things that protect the privileges of the state, that gives them permission more or less to kill us. People are upset because the grand jury didn't indict, etc. Well, hell, it's even hard to get a cop period before a court, because there are various laws that have been created in order to protect this state power. So the state uses the force of arms, creating special bodies of armed men and women to enforce its mandates and class interests. The state encompasses the police, the military, the courts, and prisons. The state forces its subjects to do things they might not want to do. The state has the coercive power to enforce its mandates. It doesn't just say, will you please do this? It says it, and you know that if you don't do it, the state has the power of coercion, the police and the jails, etc. In the US, you know, when you look at grocery stores filled with food as something that everybody needs to live, you try to take those food from the shelf, no matter how hungry you are. It's the state that steps in and protects the status quo and protects the property. So we say the capitalist state keeps the oppressed African working class from taking back the value of the labor and resources stolen and exploited from us by parasitic capitalism. I want to say something about this, because the sheriff department of Pinellas County in the state of Florida murdered 3 teenage girls, 2 15-year-olds and 1 16-year-old child. And it chased them and pushed them into a pond in a cemetery and joked. You had 17 cops in a helicopter who jokingly spoke of the drowning of the girls as they could hear them screaming. And of course, the sheriff's department manufactured, with the assistance of the local ruling class media, the idea of heroic sheriff's deputies leaping into the water to try and rescue the girls, until actually we saw videos that showed quite differently. And then they created this notion of the girls being car thieves, which is phony. I mean, they were never charged with stealing a car. And one reason they couldn't charge them with stealing a car is because they would have to explain why the 37-year-old man who picked up 2 15-year-old and 1 16-year-old girl, and who was supposed to be giving them a ride to a friend's house, ends up at a Walmart where he comes out of the store, seen coming out of the store on video with liquor. He said he's going to buy a TV, tells the cops that, but they don't sell TVs, but they sold booze. And he came out of there with a bottle of liquor, and then the girls split. They don't say that here this 37-year-old man picks up this girl, stop at the package store to pick up some booze, and then the girls split in the car. They say he's got to explain to his wife, what the hell is this car? He can say, I picked up 3 teenage girls and bought some liquor with bad intentions. He can't explain that to his wife, so he said the car was stolen. Anyway, the girls are killed. And the basic point that I want to make, however, is that the state has an illegitimate relationship to us. It's an illegitimate relationship. It's a relationship of coercion, force, violence that's imposed on us in order to maintain the status quo. And yet here we are, the victims of state oppression, not just state oppression in general, but colonial state oppression. And then we've got to come up with an excuse for why these girls died. The victims have to now explain their death, not the ones who killed the death, and through the history of this relationship. Anyway, And even if they had taken the car without permission, even if they had stolen General Motors Corporation, the point is that the state keeps the oppressed African working class from taking back the value of the labor and resources stolen and exploited from us by parasitic capitalism. That's its role. You've got the exploited. Everything that's produced is produced by those who are exploited, who create the value. Every bit of wealth that you see in this country was created by enslaved African people. You see concentrated value even in computers and what have you. And not just by Africans here, but stolen from Africans on the continent of Africa as well. So when you talk about the law, it's law that is created as an instrument of state power to protect the status quo. And the status quo means that white power is supposed to be able to continue to suck your blood, and you're not ever supposed to be able to get anything back from it. The contradiction between the African working class and the white ruling class is an antagonistic contradiction, and it is irreconcilable. You can't reconcile the interest between the slave and the slave master cannot be reconciled. There's no such thing as a good slave master. There's no such thing as a good slave master. There is no such thing as a good slave master. You cannot reconcile the interest between the slave and the slave master. You cannot reconcile the interest between the prison warden and the prisoners. There is nothing there that can be reconciled. The prisoners have to be free. The slave has to be free. In order to be free, then the slave has to kill the slave master and overturn the system of slavery, and the prisoners have to kill the warden and overturn the prison system, because it is something that serves the interests of the oppressor, of capitalism, of colonialism. So it is irreconcilable. And that's because it's antagonistic. An antagonistic, irreconcilable contradiction is one that is enforced by state violence and can only be overturned by armed revolutionary struggle by the oppressed. To win a true victory, the colonized workers must overthrow all remnants of the capitalist colonialist state power, the military, the police, etc., and replace them with the revolutionary worker state, the people's army, and defense forces. And in the beginning, that might be community control of the police. But the thing is that there's an ongoing process to disarm, to put out of commission, to certainly take out of our life the armed capacity of the colonial capitalist state. So, I mean, that's one reason we say black community control of the police, the community control of the police, not community control, not some kind of cameras and what have you that's still in the system that's controlled by the same people who made the cameras and who control the police. We've seen that how many that just simply gives you more videos of African people being killed if they let you see the video. So to win a true victory, the colonized workers must overthrow all remnants of the capitalist colonial state power, the military, the police, etc., and replace them with a revolutionary worker state, the people's army, and defense forces. Salvador Allende in Chile, and this was in 1972. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, 1966. Well, before 1972 and 66, but anyway, Allende was elected president. He was a socialist, elected president in Chile. And many people thought that his election meant that it was a new day. The socialists were in power, but it was not socialism. In part, it wasn't a socialist state. Socialism is that point in which the workers become the state, the armed workers. But the same state was in place. When he just got elected, he was elected with the same bourgeois state that was controlled by Washington, D.C. and Henry Kissinger and Richard Milhous Nixon, who was then U.S. president. He got elected, the socialists got elected, and under the authority and leadership of Nixon and Kissinger, he was overthrown and murdered. And not only was he overthrown and murdered by the same army, by the Chilean army, not only was he murdered and overthrown, that all those revolutionaries from throughout South America who came to Chile because they thought that socialism had arrived were rounded up. Maybe 30,000 or more of them are rounded up by the Chilean government or by the US government, who were using the Chilean government as proxies, and taken into soccer camps, soccer stadiums, just like the Dome, the baseball stadium here in St. Petersburg that they put in our communities, where they have the staging ground for military forces. Every time there was a rebellion in this city, they used it as a staging area. They used the soccer stadiums in Chile, and they murdered maybe 30,000 or more revolutionaries from throughout South America. The state is vicious. There is no friendly state. Salvador Allende in Chile, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana did not militarily overturn the bourgeois colonial state apparatus and replace it with the revolutionary state when they took power. And they lost power because the U.S. also controlled the army in Ghana, and they overthrew Nkrumah. Therefore, and then not just that, but look at what happened with Lumumba in 1960, 61. One of those, 60, 61. When Lumumba came to power, then they sent in the United Nations, which again is bourgeois power created, first of all, as an anti-colonial force, the state power of the ruling class, of white power, anti-colonial force. In fact, the United Nations was it was created exactly for the purpose of preventing war among white power states by sharing among themselves the authority of the colonial people around the world, so they wouldn't have to fight over those interests among themselves. And so when Lumumba comes to power, threatens all the interests, not only of Belgium, but of white power in general, for all those resources, loot, etc. in Congo, they sent the United Nations in. And the United Nations facilitated Lumumba's capture and facilitated his inability to move any place and contributed to the ability of the Stooges working with the CIA, United States CIA. They tracked Lumumba. They captured him. They tortured him. They cut him up in little pieces. They threw him in vats of acid. They burned his remains, and that's what the state does. So the bourgeois colonial state must be crushed and wiped out by an armed cadre force led by a revolutionary working class party, such as the African People's Socialist Party. And democracy is what they refer to as democracy. Everybody wants some democracy, but democracy is simply a form of the bourgeois state. And quoting from Lenin's State and Revolution, a democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism. It's a great political shell for capitalism, a democratic republic. And they use the electoral process, of course, to facilitate every place. It's democratic. You know, you can vote for who you want. Campaign election that they've got here, where they got a privatized election. They have it every place. Privatized election. You run for president, you got to have at least $1 billion. You run for this or that, you know, and they're talking about democracy, democratic. So like the ordinary workers got $1 billion they can snatch out of the bank account and then pursue some kind of election. Or in a city like St. Petersburg, Florida, 250,000, where for the first time in its history, you see the contenders for mayor spending perhaps upwards of $1 million each in pursuit of this election for a seat that pays $180,000 a year. No, this is the shell that they use, however, and they have debates that they say nobody can participate in debates except the bourgeois forces. It's a great shell for them. Everybody who believes in this thing, you know, it's not like what they can point out in some other countries and saying, look how repressive they are, because this democratic shell, democratic republic, is just the best possible political shell cover for capitalism. The fact that the people can vote or speak at a city council meeting covers over the fact that both political parties in the U.S. represent the interests of the capitalist ruling class, and that those who are not part of those capitalist, those ruling class parties, learn to speak the language and adopt the programs and concepts and everything else that the bourgeoisie wants to have. Sometimes they call themselves tricking the bourgeoisie. I'm going to beat the game. I'm going to speak and say the things that they like to hear you say. And what that means is that the mandate, if you even succeed in winning an election under those terms, that the mandate you have is a bourgeois mandate. That's your mandate. It doesn't matter. You're not tricking anybody. You've fallen into the scheme of accepting the notion that the Democratic Republic is some kind of real democracy. So the democratic form of the bourgeois state masks the colonial reality for African people. And part of what this means is that you have African people who were colonized here and around the world. And it's really interesting because a person living in France, a white person in France, is unaware, likely to be unaware, or even unconcerned about what the French government is doing in Mali or in Ivory Coast or some other place like that. No, it's because in France they have sidewalk cafes, they have the highest culture in the world, silliness like that. They have peace and calm until, of course, more and more Africans and Arabs are coming in and is shaking the tranquility a bit. But the French are as likely, the white people in America are as likely to be as uninformed about what is happening with African people living in the same city that they live in as the French who live in Europe are about the African who lives in Ivory Coast or Mali. There's a huge gulf, and the democratic shell, the whole democratic form of the bourgeois state keeps really the real class contradiction disguised, and white people think they know everything about the world, but they don't even know where the bread from or the milk that feeds their children or anything like that is being extorted. It's being coming under ruinous conditions. They brag about their sophistication. They got these great computers and the highest expressions of civilized technology and what have you. They don't understand how it came as a consequence of crushing the life out of African people in Congo, in Sierra Leone, or in what they call South Africa and every place else. They're just happy there. And they can vote for the president or for the prime minister or for whomever is going to keep those goodies coming to them. And they are experiencing democracy. Do you see? They are experiencing democracy. And the same thing happens in the United States. While in these communities, in the Mexican, the barrios, and the African communities on the so-called, in the concentration camps that they call Indian reservations, people are catching hell off stolen land, stolen labor, and what have you. And the white people are glorifying the democratic ability that they have to pick who is going to be the next exploiter of the world. Except they don't say the next exploiter. They say who's going to be able to keep the loot coming, who's going to be able to keep the resources, my refrigerator filled, keep my pocketbook filled, make sure that I got a good retirement fund. And that retirement fund and everything they're talking about comes from exploitation of somebody else. But that's the democratic model. That's the difference also in how the state, that explanation of how the state functions and how capitalism came into being off of the exploitation and oppression of Africans and other colonized people. So the democratic form of the bourgeois state masks the colonial reality for African people. And Africans are confused by this as well. Because what happens to Africans is that they do everything they can to dull or cut the umbilical cord that African people have with our history. So you don't have a history until you wake up one morning in a slum that's being created by white power. Your history, your achievement is somehow working your way out of the ghetto, getting a good job and not sagging or something to this effect when you don't even understand how you got in the ghetto. And your coming to the ghetto is what made them rich and civilized and you poor and barbaric. Anyway. So you say, Well, you can't vote nowhere else. I heard a Negro say this. Well, where can you go other than this where you can vote? And Malcolm X said, even when they let you vote, you end up voting for nobody. So Engels noted that in some parts of North America, the state public power is weak. And what he's talking about is like the army and the public power. And he is confused by this. He offers an explanation of why this is the case. But the reality is the public power was weak when he wrote this at a particular time because white people, ordinary white citizens, functioned as arms of the state. That's why you have lynch mobs, Ku Klux Klan, various other kinds of organs, the Texas Rangers, who started as a citizen thing. The Texas Rangers were only later incorporated formally into the state. And so you had these entities, and so the public power didn't have to be strong because if you got a horde of white people who get privileged to killing Indians, taking us scalps off their heads, to stealing the land of the indigenous people and what have you, you didn't need to have a cavalry around every corner. The white people themselves were the cavalry because they were getting rich. They were escaping from a Europe that had nothing to offer, where they had no houses, they had no property of their own. They can come to this place, they can take everything that they want, and they facilitate the rise of capitalism and the strength of the capitalist power, and they become an arm of the capitalist state. They did that not only here, but you've seen that. You've seen that in Israel, you've seen that in South Africa, where every child, white child, as soon as he or she gets capable of holding up on her own weapon, they're taught to shoot and kill, etc. They have to do stints in the military, etc., because they become part of the state. So capitalism and the capitalist state were born parasitic through the enslavement of African people. Anyway, I want to, we're not going to be able to go through all of this. I do want to encourage people to read this, the whole thing. And we're going to end a little earlier, not now, but a little earlier than what we normally, when we normally end this discussion. But part of what I really want to draw out here is that a lot of people don't like white people, and they say, well, this is the reason I'm going to, damn the white man, undo this and that. And that's a normal kind of response to the fact that white people function as arms of the colonial state. That's what we said before. They are the colonizer, wherever they are, etc. But that misses the point, because you don't take power over your life. You don't change circumstances just by hating white people or even doing something to white people. You identify what the contradiction is. You identify the contradiction is colonialism that gave birth to capitalism, the captivity, enslavement, colonial domination of African people and other people around the world. And you know you got to end that. But you can't end that unless you crush the power. And the power is the state. It's the colonial bourgeois state has to be crushed, has to be put out of our lives. That's why we say black community control the police. That's why we organize our own so that we can put the police on trial. We can say that we're going to have our own hearings to determine whether somebody's going to be indicted or not. That's why we do this. This is a part of the process of achieving our own power. It's a dual power as we characterize it. But the fact is that the colonial state power has to be defeated. And we are engaged in a struggle with history behind us that tells us some things about how we can begin that process even before you achieve an actual capacity to overturn it. You start it off. You begin to undermine it. You begin to create institutions of power to the people, which is what undermines it. Because and this is when we say recognize that revolution is an art and a science. And part of that science is recognizing the condition that we suffer from, and then what it's going to take to get rid of it. So we have to destroy the colonial state. its authority over our lives. We have to try to bring as many of the masses of people into the process of crushing the colonial state as possible. Black community control the police. Bring the masses in. Have our own courts where we put the cops on trial. Bring the masses in. Let the people begin to exercise their power, their authority over our own lives. This is part of what we do. Create our own child care collectives, our own housing projects, etc. The masses participate in changing the relationship that we have to the state. And then it's really important to understand that not only are we trying to crush the authority of the colonial state over us, and when you know that's what you're doing, then anybody can be your ally who unites in the process of eliminating the authority of white power, the colonial power. And that means even white people. So this notion about the white man this and the white man that, the white man this, who acts like the colonizer, is one white man. And I'm not talking about if they say they like you or not, because that doesn't even make any difference. They wear dreads. If they're not about overturning this state relationship, the power of white power, the state, over our lives, then I don't care if you are married to them. I don't care. The thing is, they have to be engaged in that. If we can be won to that participation, then you've got a different kind of relationship. So it's not just a subjective relationship. But the other thing that's really important to understand is that even if as you engage in the struggle against that apparatus, you have to create your own power. That's what black power means. We have to have the power. Black power is black state power. Black power is self-rule. Black power is self-government. Black power is being in charge of our own affairs by overturning their state, creating our own state. And we create our own state even in the process of overturning their state, so that now we are the government, our own government, as opposed to them being our own government. So anything that's not going in that direction, and I don't mean that just here, because once you understand this, and you understand that the bourgeois or colonial white power state is born as a state internationally, it's everywhere, then you know that you got to have a state that's everywhere too. That means also you recognize that there is no freedom for African people in New York as long as African people everywhere else are oppressed. There's no new African. This is the same old African. Then we oppress everywhere we are, and you can shut your eyes to that reality by calling yourself new, but you're catching the same old hell that Africans are catching in Angola, Africans catching in Jamaica, Haiti, every place else. We are one African people. And so we have to have one African organization that can achieve collective state power over this oppressor that's killing us all. So I've got just a few minutes, brothers and sisters, comrades, where we can have some discussion, because believe it or not, I got to rush off to church, and I got to go to church with some candidates who are going to be making an appearance in black church here, and I want to be there when they talk about reparations and black community control of the police and other things like that. So I would like to open it up for anybody who wants to talk, and I know a lot of people want to talk, and we don't have much time, so don't be sitting in the cut waiting for somebody else to start it. Start it yourself. Uhuru. Uhuru. Who is it? Is someone saying something?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Hello?
Uhuru.
I can barely hear something. Is someone speaking?
Uhuru, can you hear me?
Barely hear you, comrade. I'm looking at the technician or engineer here, and he's just giving a thumbs up, so you ought to be able to say something. Go ahead. Uhuru.
Yeah.
Is that Otika out of New York?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Yes. First, I want to really appreciate this study. It's always good to go back and refresh what we understand about African internationalism and how the state, what the role that the state plays, or the colonial state plays. My question is about the state and the future of an independent, self-determined Africa.
Hold on.
Does the state...
what's up, bro? Go ahead. The future, you were saying about the state. Go ahead, Oteka.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's in that kind of that direction. But I do want to know, like, with that being said, are we saying the state, or the state in general, having a African, state, us, governing that, is that just ruled out officially, when we finally achieve, full independence and freedom?
You say when we have state power government, what did you say about that?
Yeah, my question is are we saying that the state is all bad? Even
the state is coercive. It doesn't matter who. But what happens is when the working class has state power, then the majority is in power, and then we use that state power. We say it's coercive. We use that state power to crush. We institute the dictatorship of the proletariat or the working class. That means that the bourgeoisie does not have access to radio, television, free speech, that they will not be able to run around trying to reintroduce slavery, colonialism, and the kinds of relationship that we have now. That means that they will be stripped from all of the resources they've stolen from the people, the ability to feed, clothe, and house the people now become the possession of the people through this state power that is now the state power of the working class. The existing state power protects capitalism from the proletariat. And so it means that now that the workers have state power, that we can take over the hospitals and make sure that free healthcare, free education, and things like that exist. So yeah, it is repressive. It is repressive against the bourgeoisie. It is also the instrument through which we begin to re-educate masses of people and break free from the traditions that have been imposed on us so long that many of us have imitate our oppressors, etc. Yes, it would be repressive. That's who's going to get repressed is the question that we're confronted with.
And so when we are free, we won't need the state.
No, when we are free, we're going to need the state temporarily, but long enough to reorganize society and production so that it's not based on exploitation. The only reason there is a need for a state is because somebody's getting exploited. To the moment we can reorganize society so that we end class society, end the existence of exploitation, then the state itself becomes redundant. And as opposed to, as Marx put it, something like, as opposed to being an instrument for governing people, the state becomes an instrument through which we manage things. So the state withers away. Yeah.
Hello, this is Taylor.
This is who? Yes, Taylor. Hold on.
I just have a question. So what will we do about places like India who have their own like oppression built into a lot of their like religions, but then who are also in turn colonized by white Europeans?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because here's what we recognize, that there are contradictions in all things. However, there is a main contradiction around which all the others revolve, without which none of the others can survive. The main contradiction is the oppression of nations by nations. The fact that India is dominated and has been dominated first by England and now by a cacophony of, by a collection of powers, US, etc., capital dominates that. It means that it ossifies all of those relationships based on exploitation that exists inside India itself. So the main contradiction is against the imperial powers. Defeat the imperial powers. Do everything that's necessary to raise up to the ascendancy the workers. The workers in India have to come to ascendancy too. And of course, as we know in India, we got the situation like Dalits, where we got this whole strata of stratified society based on what they call caste and slavery and near slavery, untouchables and this kind of stuff, that too will go away. And part of the reason it's going to go away is because the dominant society, with the liberation of Africa and African people, now becomes a socialist African internationalist dominated society. Dominated world economy now becomes a socialist African internationalist world economy. So all over the world, you might not have people who are socialists or who are African internationalists, but that becomes the dominant trajectory in history. Just like in different places in the world, you don't have capitalists or white people who dominate. You just got white capitalist political and economic power that sets the terms for how everything is going to exist throughout that society. So the primary contradiction is the contradiction that exists between oppressed and oppressor nations. And that's why the primary enemy doesn't mean it's the only enemy, doesn't mean it's not the only contradiction, doesn't mean that you don't sometimes have to go and deal with some minor contradictions in order to get to the primary contradiction. But it does recognize that the strategic contradiction is the contradiction between oppressed and oppressor nations. So yeah, all of that is factored in and will be, and it's not just, India is just one example. You know, there are others that you can think of existing across, you know, around the world. Uhuru.
We have something from Facebook. Cam Howard from Chicago. Describe how the American Revolution was the same relationship as the feudal class in Europe rebelling against the landlords to replace and introduce a new oppressive state.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that that was raised, because it's not just in the U.S. That happened throughout what is now referred to as South America, where you have white people who came to these territories. Look at Australia. White people came to Australia as Australia was a prison colony. It was a prison colony for the British. And so you have these white people who come here, and then they are tied to the economies of England, and particularly England, but other places around the world, where they feed the stolen loot that's coming from the Americas and from the resources of enslaved African people into the economies of Europe and England in particular. And then they determine finally that they are not free. And one reason they are not free is because the British are now getting all the loot that they are extorting from the Indians, so-called Indians, and from black people, from black slavery. So they say, why should we be sending this all to England? Why should we be paying taxes to England while we doing all the work of enslaving and brutalizing, you know, black people and indigenous people? We want to be free. We want free trade. We want to have the right to sell black people, because only now England has the nobility, the monarchy has all of this. We want this as well. And so they rise up in this, fighting this noble democratic cause to take control of the slavery and the indigenous territory for themselves, as opposed to allowing the British to have the English monarchy to have them. And they write noble declarations and write incredible constitutions that against oppression and exploitation, but they're talking about their own oppression while they are in the process of stealing, killing, committing genocidal acts against the indigenous and the African people here. So that's the institution that we look at. We look at the United States of America and all of its democracy. It is a quote unquote democracy, which is simply a form of the state. Whereas before it was feudal state, where that sent all of these people who were overcrowding England, or it was something that came from that process and then and helped to facilitate the introduction of capitalism into the world, escalated the process of capitalist development in the world. And this is all this noble stuff that you hear about the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, et cetera, has its foundation in slavery and the taking this land from the indigenous people, and as a part of the process that facilitated the overthrow of a monarchy and feudalism in Europe. Uhuru. Anybody else? We got just a few minutes.
Uhuru, this is Chicharo out of St. Louis. I'm glad that you talked about this definition and redefinition of Black power. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Nixon said that he kind of attempted to redefine Black power, but that was supported the aims of the capitalist state. When he said that if by Black power you mean instead of violent revolution, you mean black banks and black insurance companies, etc. He said that if we can, we can get black people to stop becoming critics of free enterprise, he said, and to become supporters of free enterprise, then I can support that idea of black power. Can you talk a little bit about that distinction between how he's defining black power, which many of us still do today, and how we define black power, and how we talk about that today?
I think that's really, 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 really important, because here is what you're really introducing, as quiet as it's kept, is the class question, because only the working class ultimately is going to be able to lead this struggle to overturn even our national oppression. We're talking about national oppression. All of the black people are oppressed one way or another. And some black people, Africans, are oppressed because the system prevents them from becoming successful capitalists. It acts in a very prejudicial way against their becoming successful capitalists. They can't get the loans, they can't get the grants, they can't get access to capital like the white capitalists can. And so for them, black power is having access to that. Black freedom means that. For them, but that capitalism, that freedom comes at the expense of the enslavement and colonization of the majority of our people. And that's the issue. And because Nixon is a splendid example of the black capitalism that he promoted. In fact, one of the civil rights organizations that united with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1966, when it called for black power, was the Congress of Racial Equality, which at that time was under the leadership of a man named Floyd McKissick. McKissick actually got a huge grant from the Nixon administration to set up something that I think they would call Soul City, where they got infusion of a lot of money to set up capitalist enterprises. And he was promoting black capitalism, etc. And black capitalist is somebody who would succeed at the expense of African people who produce value. Capitalists do not produce value. Value is produced by the people who are exploited by the capitalists, whether they're black, Mexicans, whatever you want to call them. They are exploiting the labor of the oppressed people, and certainly of African people. The majority of African people come from working class. In fact, we were notoriously the premier beginning working class in the capitalist system was the African people. And our thing is to be free, while their thing was to become capitalist. That is to say, they wanted to integrate into the system, and we wanted to get out of the damn system that was oppressing and exploiting us. So this black capitalism thing and making capitalism act right, the capitalism we're supposed to be, is what you will often hear them articulate, is just another explanation of why they want to exploit African people. That's what they want. Even when they talk militant rhetoric, because sometimes they might even be willing to shoot a capitalist, a white capitalist, if they can become a black capitalist, if they can have custody over the system of exploitation. So the fact that somebody's willing to shoot somebody or pick up a gun is not enough. The question is, what kind of social system are they trying to create? One social system puts the working class in power, the workers who produce all value. There is no value created outside of the working class, or whether they want to have some other sector in power. And that's the distinctive thing. So we talk about black power in a revolutionary fashion, and black power force, it has to mean state power. But for us, for it to reach the real conclusion, it has to be state power that's achieved under the leadership of the African working class and the advanced detachment of that class, which is the African People's Socialist Party. And so, comrade, yeah, let's go ahead. One more. Yeah.
One more question from Facebook, and this is from Siali Moyinda. Can you explain what a caste system is?
A caste system? No, I can't. I mean, you can look up that. I think it's one of the strangest things. I mean, somebody who's lived as we have, as African people, under this colonial domination, but it is a system where they have a certain kind of hierarchy in the society that's based on a predetermined location that different groups of people would be. Like in India, they have the so-called untouchables. There are some people born into a caste that actually, I think it's the Brahmins in England who are the educated class, and there's some who are caste as some, and that's how they function, and that's the thing that they're born into. They're often the most educated, and they're people who are in the business, etc. I don't have a good definition for it, but I have just these kinds of examples. And the Dalits are the servile, most oppressed, the untouchables, all the nasty work, dirty work, and they are spat upon, looked upon in a very hostile, negative way by the other people like in that society. So I want to just ask people to really pay attention to the activities of the Uhuru movement, African People's Socialist Party. I know announcements are going to be made, are forthcoming, and not the least of which is the September, is that 17th? Date is the NPDM convention. That's in September. I think it's somebody on this phone knows it. Give me the exact date. Somebody on this, September 16th. That's going to be in St. Louis, so you should be buying your ticket now. There's going to be also in Chicago, Illinois, on August 12th and 13th at Chicago State University. The Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations is hosting its annual conference. It's going to be an extremely important conference. We're going to have people like Charles Barron, the assemblyman out of New York, people like Glenn Ford, Black Agenda Report, Lisa Davis out of Newark, who is the vice chair of the coalition, Cam Howard out of Chicago, who is an important force in the reparations movement, specifically in COBRA, and he's also leader of the Amos T. Wilson Institute. We're going to have people like Khalid Rahim out of Pittsburgh, who is chair of the New African Independence Party. Zaki Barudi out of St. Louis, Missouri, who is the President General of the Universal African Peoples Organization. Going to have just Akile Kenyon out of St. Petersburg, Florida, who is a District 6 contender for City Council. There are going to be a lot of really important participants, a lot to learn, and it's going to be happening under the theme of the ballot and the bullet. War and elections, war and peace in the era of Donald Trump. A lot of people are already getting their tickets, loading up, going to Chicago. You can get more information on that by going to blackisbackcoalition.org. So those are some of the immediately pending events, and there's going to be a lot of people joining me in December 9th through the 16th, because I'm going to be on a cruise for a fundraiser for the African Socialist International. And we're going to be going to places like Puerto Rico and to the Bahamas and to Grand Turk. And it's going to be a 7-day trip. And people should go ahead and sign up for that. And we're going to just be off the grid for a while, have a good time, do political education, take excursions, and just chill. And everybody wants to can join me on that. And you can simply go to the Uhuru, U-H-U-R-U, Uhuru Legacy Cruise.org. Uhuru LegacyCruise.org. That's Chango whispering in my ear. So you can, I want to express appreciation to everybody for being here. We'll be with you again next, just one more announcement. Yes, one announcement I want to make is Africa Live is going to be happening. You should stay tuned. Tune into Africa Live that starts at 11. And next Sunday, Comrade Louise is going to be leading an incredible study. So go ahead and make your last announcement.
Also, Burning Spear newspaper, Burning Spear Media will be having its Black August celebration or commemoration. So stay tuned. Go to go to the burningspear.com and you can find out more information about that. Again, the Burning Spear Media, Burning Spear newspaper will be commemorating Black August. Go to theburningspear.com. All right. So that's pretty much it for O'Malley Talk. We want to thank everyone out there for participating. And next Sunday, same time, 8 a.m. Eastern, here on Black Power 96.3 FM, on Facebook on O'Malley Ishitella, and also on YouTube on the Burning Spear TV YouTube. Thank you so much, and have an excellent morning.